All right, should be going now. Okay, so we will start off with mentioning that Emily has tried to be here. Spent 20 minutes trying to get in, but can't figure out how to get her in for some reason. All right. So to start off, little overview of it. It says 7 months after the Columbia accident, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, CAIB, presented their report on the causes of the accident. The board pinpointed the technical cause of the accident. It also identified organizational issues with NASA dating back decades. The CAIB also reported how manager might have behaved differently during the mission and stressed the organizational shortcoming at NASA that contributed to the catastrophe. Okay, so it says what is the issue? What was the issue in this case study that we're really focused on?
Well, am I the only one that was kind of surprised by how many issues that I feel like NASA's systems had overall? I feel like for being NASA and dealing with space, which, you know, is unknown in people's lives, I feel like they had a lot of problems with, you know, people didn't know who to go to, people didn't listen. Sorry, my child is crying. But overall, I feel like the problem analysis of my paper was so long. I don't know if that was just me though, but.
No, I agree. That's why I skipped this one. I read it, but it's my one I didn't want to write it on.
Mine was the same thing, Eve. My project analysis was the longest part. My recommendations seemed pretty simple and easy, like don't be stupid kind of stuff. So yeah, and I honestly, I had to go back. I was like, I don't even remember having heard about this the first time around. I didn't even remember.
Yeah, that surprised me that I didn't remember this ever happening. I mean, how do I not remember that? It was 2003. I was old enough to remember that, and people are dying. How do we not? How was that not as big publicized? You know. Anybody else with any specific issues, I guess, that we're dealing with, or anything that stood out to you that was an issue?
I think the thing that bothered me the most was how like people that had lower positions were afraid or like didn't feel like they could talk to their superiors. And I feel like if there was a more open and like mutually open line of communication between everyone, obviously lives could be saved. But I feel like just most problems could be avoided instead of like talking with people around you, like just going straight to whoever your supervisor is, because I don't know, it just kind of bothered me that people said that they couldn't, or like they felt like they couldn't talk to their superiors, and like even if they did say something, it was kind of shot down, and they're like, oh, it's not going to be a problem because it wasn't a problem in the past, and obviously it was a disaster. So
yeah, to follow up at that point, they even talked about like in meetings where they would bring it up, they were getting shut down and cut off in the middle of their talking. And they're like, well, that doesn't really provide a whole lot of opportunity for people to be able to give you important feedback about system failures.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like overall, just the whole culture kind of NASA, it was very much, you just shrug off a problem, which surprised me a lot because you're dealing with one of the biggest things. It's new, no one knows much about it, and it's like, oh, here's this problem. Oh, whatever, it'll be fine. Oh, whatever, it'll fix itself. Like with the O-rings, like it was a substitution and they just didn't really pay attention to it. Or the foam stuff falling off. It's like, oh, we'll fix that later. I felt like that's how everything was.
Yeah, I also thought that, like, I mean, there were several issues, but just from having the daily meetings that they were supposed to hold, and they only did like not even half the time. And then things would be brought up in the meeting or brought up to somebody higher up, and then it wouldn't even get addressed until maybe like the next meeting, or it's just like the urgency wasn't there, which I thought was so strange when you're dealing with people's lives. So it was just crazy how things were handled, and it was like a snowball effect. But and there was that Rocha guy, was he an engineer or what was his role? The one that kept bringing stuff up and then he kept getting kind of shut down.
I think he was
I
an
couldn't
engineer.
remember. Okay, yeah, I couldn't remember everybody's role, but I felt really bad for that guy because he like kept trying to bring it to people's attention and nobody really wanted to listen to him or hear him out.
Yeah, that's good. And, you know, kind of along with the very lazy attitude towards it, I feel like they kind of seemed worried when they first noticed the foam falling off, but then they eventually just got comfortable with it because nothing bad had happened yet. They said, "Oh well, that's just par for the course. It just is going to happen. Oh well," and they didn't really look into exactly what could happen from that or what they could do to put more effort into solving the problem. So it just seemed odd that they were willing to shrug it off so quickly. Um, is there any more on that from anybody?
Well, if you want me to, I can name some of the other problems that I found, just because it really was the longest part of my paper. Because of budget cuts, I feel like they were skimping out on a lot of things that probably should not have been skimped out of. I mean, take out the entire thing that nobody would listen. But the other book that we're having to read for class right now, for our discussion, talks a lot about, you know, trust and listening and stuff like that. And I think that was one of their biggest problems. You hire these people to do a job, and he did his job, and he said, "This is dangerous, this is dangerous, this is dangerous." And they didn't trust that. They kept saying, "No, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine." And I just feel like if they would have trusted the employee that they hired to do that job, the engineer who said, "This is not right," they could have saved lives. And also, I'm super annoyed at Ham, whoever that was. I can't remember exactly his job, but he did not listen to anybody, and he was too worried about leadership and moving up, and there was unclear communications, and I just felt like there was a lot of problems considering this was NASA, and I'm upset about this case.
Yeah, and I think that the whole problem in my paper was that it's all politics. It's all politics. It is NASA never gets on the front page anymore unless they do something bad. They went to the moon. Great. Now what? That was back then. Now, well, let's, do we have people on Mars yet? Or it's only when they do things bad do they get on the front page. And I think that because it's led and it's a government funded, so much of it is about politics. They want to see what is the result. What is the next step? When are they going to get their next program off the ground? Everything's about the deadline to be able to, explain their funding, why they're getting their money, what are they doing with it? Are they meeting their guidelines? Are they meeting the deadlines? And all of that is more important than the end result. I think that if it was a privatized system where it was run by engineers and people who knew what they were doing, and they weren't so concerned about the time constraints that they needed to get it done when they needed to get it done by, I think you wouldn't see these loopholes. But when these loopholes pop up and these issues arise, everybody's more, if they had known that it was going to cost lives, I'm sure they would have changed it. But their concern was more, we're going to miss our deadlines, and that was more of the priority. And so I don't think it was that they thought that these weren't issues, because I'm sure they were issues. They just didn't think they were significant enough issues to push back the deadline and deal with the issues they were going to have to deal with the publicity and with the higher ups and all the politics involved. I think if NASA was a private corporation, I don't think you'd have the problems that you've seen with it. I think because it's so politicized that it has the issues that it does.
I feel like at the very end, though, when the person was like being interviewed by the like the news reporter, or like he was talking with someone, and he said that he still like refused to like say that like they knew about it beforehand or that it was an issue. So I think there was a lot of pride going on with some of the leaders because they kind of refused to admit that like they had made a mistake. And I think that was another major issue, because I feel like good leaders are able to recognize and like own up to their own mistakes and like work from there. But if you don't even like say that, yeah, you messed up, then you're just going to keep messing up because you just want to keep burying it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. All right, so the next thing on here says the recovery window, the time period between a threat and a major accident or prevented accident in which collective action is possible. So, the time period between a threat and an accident is what the recovery window is defined as. So what was the recovery window in this case? I guess what was the threat for this case? Anybody? With regards to the accident, so let's get a little bit more specific. With regards to the accident, what was the threat? That's okay. I didn't understand this question before I read the hint, so I'll just go ahead and go with it. So the threat for the case was the foam being lost, and the accident, major accident or prevented accident, this one was major, was the Columbia exploded. So the time between when they realized the foam was falling off and when the Columbia exploded, that was the recovery window. And since nothing was done, obviously the recovery window went unused and a catastrophe ended up happening. So that's all that it really has for that little section right there with the recovery window. But does anybody have any thoughts on that? Have you ever had experience with that where maybe you've missed an opportunity and it ended up coming out bad even though you had signs before?
Well, I'll just add that the chart in the case study says that their first known foam shedding event was of June of 1983. And sorry about my baby, by the way. And the Columbia, them trying to come back in, happened in 2003. So that's a 20-year gap, and I realized that they had a lot of incidences in between where it wasn't a huge thing. But I feel like that's a lot of time to realize that you have a problem and fix the problem. And again, they said a lot in the case, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to deal with it. But I just feel like that's a big gap that they could have probably found a solution, or at least noticed it better. Okay, I'm going to get off because my kid.
Yeah, that's a good point. But again, I kind of wonder how far into having an issue do you just say, okay, this isn't a bad enough issue to really worry that much about, kind of like what Jeff was saying. They knew it was an issue, but maybe they just didn't have it at the top of their priority list because it hadn't caused anything serious. And so I think once it makes it past a certain point, they're just not even going to focus on it anymore. I think that's how it got to be 20 years down the road.
I agree with what you just said, Forrest, about that. Like, you could just get lax because nothing bad has happened before. But I think in this, what did you call it? The recovery gap thing?
Yeah, recovery window.
Recovery window. I think that one of the most, well, the whole thing in between was kind of a mess up. But the fact that it was about 24 hours or something that they didn't even notice that a huge chunk of film had fallen off, I think that's crazy because it happened during, I mean, correct me, but didn't it happen during takeoff? And so, or close to. And that's one of the times that you would watch the most carefully. And so I think it's interesting. It happened towards the beginning. I didn't even notice it for quite a few hours. And then from there, it was kind of a domino effect of showing all the other problems in NASA. The fact that it took like 5 days for something to happen and them to talk about it. But
And also, let's bear in mind that you're talking about something flying into space and dropping crap all over the world. Like, you know, you'd think you'd pay better attention to where stuff is falling out of the sky, but you know, that's just me.
Well, kind of going back to whoever talked about there being the budget cuts, it talked about how they didn't even have like that many cameras on the shuttle when it was taking off, and it talked about how like each mission cost however $1 million, and I feel like instead of trying to spread the money out into like as many projects as possible, if they had focused more on quality than quantity, there probably would have been at least better ways to recognize what had happened with like having additional cameras or just like focusing more on a couple things than trying to be everywhere all at once.
Yeah, that was part of my solution was definitely, you know, paying more attention with cameras, figuring out a way to have cameras looking at every part of it, whether it's somehow built in or whether it's from the outside. But clearly they need to monitor each flight a lot more carefully to be able to see those things and understand why it's happening and how to fix it. What is human cognitive biases and how does it apply to the case? Does anybody know what cognitive biases are?
Nope, I was gonna Google it right now. Do you have the answer?
Yep, I wouldn't have known, so I can just go ahead and give that. Symptomatic errors in judgment. Confirmation bias are...
I'm sorry, that sounds like voters in the political process.
Systematic errors in judgment, yeah. So I guess how does systematic errors in judgment play into our case? We've talked about it a little bit, it seems like, but any specific thoughts with that in mind?
Could you say the question one more time, please?
How does cognitive biases play into the case? How does that apply to the case?
Well, something that I noticed was there was someone that had said that NASA was like a bureaucratic, like just old school type company. And I feel like since they kept, or organization, I guess, and since they kept that mentality with just how they interacted with their employees and just how lower people wouldn't talk to people in higher positions, I feel like since that was something from the beginning that never really developed into like a more interactive type place, that obviously like further down the road, like communication never was made between people, and if they had kind of developed that over the years, then it would have been easier for them to talk to each other. So I guess that was like a lapse in judgment made consistently.
And one of the part that I put in my thing was talking about this debris assessment team being able to have direct communication with the mission management team, and be able to have an area where they can say, hey, here's what we found, here's what we're noticing, here's what we're looking at, here's the crap that's falling from the sky, here's what it means, and being able to make sure that there's open lines of communication with the management team. I think that in any organization, if you have the people that are on the ground, the boots that are on the ground that are doing the work, that don't have a line of communication with their superiors, the superiors are never really going to know what's happening on the ground. And I think that's what happened with this debris assessment team not having direct access over 20-something years, like Eve mentioned. If they're not being able to communicate that information to the collective brain trust, then the brain trust is not going to know what the problems are.
So kind of the systematic error started at the bottom and worked its way up with just bad communication there. Yeah. So what evidence is present in this case of some of the biases? So what are some specific people or instances on where they showed biases?
One thing that stuck out to me was that mathematical crater model that they used to do testing, and how it was said that people just didn't really find it as effective, or they kind of didn't rely on the test as heavily. So I just was wondering, why, if they don't trust it, why are they still using that same way to test things? It didn't make sense, even though the test results showed that it was an issue. And then there was something else that I was going to say. I can't remember. I lost my train of thought. But yeah, that was just a bias that I thought. Sorry, come back to me. I'm going to look through my notes.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, that definitely is one, where somebody, or maybe the group as a whole, just felt like they didn't like that reading or that report from it. The specific one that it gives here says, at the flight readiness review meeting, senior NASA managers concluded that the foam shedding was an acceptable risk. Each safe return of a shuttle, despite numerous foam strikes, affirmed management's belief there was a low risk of failure. So their bias was that it just was an acceptable risk and they didn't need to worry about it too much. Was there any other cases or instances that you guys had thought of for that?
I kind of want to defend the people that were in charge a little bit just based off of what you just said, because I feel like anyone that's working for NASA should have pretty good ideas of what is good, what's bad. They understand how things work, at least to a certain degree. And I feel like they were probably I'm trying to figure out how to word it. I'm sure they believe that there wasn't a risk. Even though people were trying to say that there was. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Unless you guys kind of get what I'm saying. I'm sure they took into account at least a little bit what people were saying, but they had their own knowledge and background that they took what they heard and made their decision based off of what they know would hopefully be right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if they're the NASA managers, I would. And I mean, just what they ended up coming up with as a group was that it was an acceptable risk. Probably because they just didn't have the full knowledge of the outcome that it could cause from that. Yeah, that's a good point, though. I doubt any of them were willing to put anybody's life at risk if they actually believed their life was at risk. So maybe it was just not enough knowledge from their team, and maybe they had a little bit of pride in that point. I don't know. Okay, so the next question is, what is shared cognitive framing? Does anybody know that one? All right. It says, frameworks, beliefs, and assumptions that help us simplify a complicated reality. What evidence is present in this case of cognitive framing?
So you mean they're dummying it down? Is that a better phraseology for that?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
so.
so you need to dummy down the definition so that I can understand it.
Yeah.
Okay, can you just repeat the question and the definition one more time?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure it out. So shared cognitive framing. Here's the definition. It's frameworks, beliefs, and assumptions that help us simplify a complicated reality. And then the question is, what evidence is present in the case of cognitive framing?
My assumption would be, as we're still talking about this foam thing, that engineers are explaining to them this is happening. The management team is saying, oh, well, that always happens. Oh, well, if that always happens and it's never been a problem, then we don't really need to worry about it. I think would be the kind of definition or example of that.
That makes it a little bit more clear for me. So maybe just kind of generalizing it, or like you said, like it says, make it more simple. So they took the specifics out of it and didn't really look into the depth that maybe they should have.
This might be another example, and I hope I'm on the right track. My Wi-Fi is kind of cutting out, so sometimes you guys are cutting in and out. But another example maybe of that would be, if you guys remember, this isn't about the phone, but it's about the O-rings at the beginning and how he warned them, this might happen if it goes below. It could be very dangerous. And they were like, oh, well, it might happen, but we're going to push for it anyway because it's not like a definite thing. They sort of skimmed around it, and then it did happen, and there was an explosion, and people died, of course, because apparently that happens in NASA.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes along with the assumptions that it says here as part of that definition. They assumed that nothing bad would happen, even if there was that problem or whatever. They assumed that the outcome wouldn't be as catastrophic as it ended up being. Would it? Oh, sorry. Hold on one second. So what it was giving for an example of the cognitive framing, it said NASA viewed their program as an operational rather than an experimental endeavor, which causes riskier decision making. NASA sold their program to an economic grounds, claiming that using a shuttle over multiple missions was more cost effective. So they looked at it more of a business type operation rather than experimental. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that it's almost seems like NASA was trying to say, "Hey, we've got this figured out. So this is the process, and this is what the process is going to be every time," rather than saying we're still trying to figure this thing out and giving areas for them to be able to learn and grow and find out from their mistakes. They're kind of trying to package it as if it's, "Hey, this is the system. It works every time. We've got no problems," and then you start to overlook things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that until I read that, and that's a good point because when you run it like it's an experiment, you have so many more controls in place. You have so many more um, cautions that you're worried about compared to just if it's an operation. Sorry about that. So when did the problems with Columbia begin? And I guess that could be, I mean, that's all it says. When did the problems with Columbia begin? That could be either the communication problems or the technical problems, organizational, whatever. When did those problems begin? All right, I'll just go ahead and give what I was thinking. Immediately, my mind goes to when they first noticed foam falling off in 1983, like was pointed out. That's when I think the problems began. Because if that had been taken care of at that point, then it would have been a lot less um, likely that this would have happened. And along with the O-ring thing as well, if both of those had been taken care of when they were discovered rather than let go, then even the communication errors in the future would not have been as much of a problem if those had been handled. Why did the debris strikes become an acceptable risk?
Because they hadn't been a problem before. They hadn't caused problems before. There's no significance to it.
Yeah. Anybody else? Is there anything else for that?
Not only they've happened so frequently. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say the same thing, that it was just like a normal thing, that it's an expectation when you're going into space. Go ahead.
Yeah, just that it happens so frequently and almost every single time. And I think the fact that they knew that there wasn't anything that they could really do about it sort of just pushed them to continue to just let it happen.
So that just made me have a thought. Maybe I'm remembering incorrectly or mixing it up with something else, but didn't the foam generally come off of one side rather than the other? Like, it wasn't random. It was a specific part that it kept coming off, wasn't it? That really seems interesting to me now. I don't know why all of a sudden that just popped out to me, but seems like they should have been able to I don't know, diagnose why it was happening on one side, not the other, you know? Maybe there's different circuitry on one side that was heating it up from the inside and causing a problem, or maybe there was it was heavier, I don't know. But that just all of a sudden sticks out to me as something that should have caused more concern rather than just letting it be acceptable. So what is the root of the situation here with the Columbia mission? So if you have to get down to one base issue, what is that with the Columbia mission?
I think the issue might have been not starting from the beginning, like when the first foam incident happened. Like, I feel like a place like NASA should want to know why things aren't working or how to improve things to like make exploration and like innovation just more successful. So I feel like if they had taken the time at the very beginning to figure out the root cause of why there's foam issues at the beginning, they could have like worked their way to like improving the shuttle's like design or whatever it was that was causing it. So I think just not taking the time to figure out the whys and then like actually doing it.
Yeah, I agree with Shelby. I think it's interesting that it's like they created a model or a design that worked. Then they said, okay, we're going to stick with this. They didn't address any of the problems. They weren't like running any tests to see how they could improve anything. And so it was just stuck with what they had rather than constant improvements. And I guess I think a lot of this has to do also, they felt like they were competing with the UK. But a lot of it was just them trying to be the first and the fastest rather than having quality to it. And I think the root of it goes back to the beginning of just, I don't know if I would necessarily say like not running tests, but I think it's more just being too relaxed on procedures and not following through with steps that were supposed to happen all along, whether it be talking to the right people or like stopping takeoff if there was a problem, but just being too relaxed on procedures.
That the whole NASA mentality was basically like that there's that I more so like, no, really prove to me that this is an issue or else it's kind of then I don't know.
Is anybody else having a hard time hearing her? Yeah, I hardly caught anything you said then.
Repeat that real quick. No,
We're just not able to hear you, Sabrina. All right. So, my thoughts on the root of the situation after the discussion that we've had so far is, maybe the experimental mindset needed to be the mindset there, and running it like a business, like maybe just I guess less than like a business, because even a business would want to put out a better product, but running it with deadlines that have to be met and running it just on somebody tells me I have to be here at this time is was the problem. If they would run it experimental, or even if it was more of a personal, privately owned business, I think that problem would have been solved. So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but how would you characterize the culture of NASA? What are the strengths and the weaknesses? So, yeah, how would you characterize the culture at NASA? Anybody?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. I was getting my kids ready for bed. Say it again.
How would you characterize the culture at NASA?
Overly political. Sort of.
Oh, can you hear me better?
Sort of.
I'll do it, and then if you um,
I think technology is failing us this evening.
I think something that maybe Sabrina was trying to say, maybe if I heard her right, I just heard her say the mentality, and then it reminded me of a part in the analysis that's talked about, like, it's a culture of, oh gosh, I should have looked this up before I started speaking. But not of, like, it's like the prove it right, prove it wrong thing that I was saying. But basically, they're just going to assume that everything's right and going right unless you prove them wrong. Whereas really, in something so serious as NASA, where you're flying people and you're flying things into space, it shouldn't be a prove me wrong. It should be a prove me right sort of thing. Like, you need to prove that all of the points match up to success, and if there's one point is missing, then it shouldn't happen. Rather than, if one point is missing, that's all right. It's not the whole thing missing. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other strengths or weaknesses about the NASA culture that anybody had?
I'll try and find a strength. I wish I had written it down and I didn't. But I remember at the beginning there was they had a problem with one of their flights, and then they created that team to basically fix problems within flight. They made a whole new team to focus solely on that. And I feel like that is one of their strengths, where if they see that there's a thing that needs to be fixed, they created a group to focus solely on that. Their problem is they did not seem to figure out how to communicate within those groups. So if I had to pick a strength and weakness, I think that those would be my two.
Yeah, it seems like they're good at coming up with or trying to solve a problem when they know it's serious. That is a good strength. You know, they gave the Apollo 13 example in there, which was crazy. They had, you know, just a few items to be able to fix their issue, and they were able to do it. But these are problems that maybe could have been resolved beforehand. They weren't communicated beforehand, and you know, along with Apollo 13 as well, that problem had been suspected, but was not carried through in the fixing or looking into that problem further, just as with the Columbia. So yeah, that's a good point. They really are good at trying to come up with something at the last minute when they know something is really going wrong. So now it's kind of asking for specific people. It says, tell me about the people in the case that were important contributors to the mission's failure. So who were the people, or maybe groups of people who were big contributors to the failure of the mission?
I would definitely say the ham person I talked about earlier. That sounds weird. That's the only thing I wrote down. I'm assuming that's their last name. But just I put that's the person who was pushing for their leadership to move up. It says that she recognized that the flawed past rationale could delay the next mission, but she also knew that the delay would jeopardize a major management goal. And she's also the same person that didn't follow through with information with the imagery. Somebody ordered to see the imagery, and she didn't track them down, and she didn't go find out who wanted it. She sort of just canceled the whole thing and pushed that back. And I'm not putting all the blame on her, but I definitely think she was one to help with the problems.
I'd say the mission management team, the MMT, as a whole, I think had a fair amount of responsibility in this.
Yeah, along with both of what you're saying, I am looking at the case study right now, and there's a part, it says Linda Ham, chair of the mission management team, was in attendance. The presentation maintained that the probability of foam loss for the upcoming flight was no higher or no lower than previous flights. So kind of got both in there, Linda Ham and who is the chair of the mission management team. And they together decided that, there was a risk, but it was no higher or lower than any previous flights. So it was an acceptable risk is the next line. It says it was declared from foam strikes as an acceptable risk. So is there anybody else that you can specifically think of that was a contributor to the failure? All right. The last little part for that is who is accountable and why.
Is that a different question?
Yeah, sorry. The last of the questions about that about the mission is who is accountable and why.
I would say that would be the same answer as the question before it. I think the engineers that or the debris assessment team, the mission management team. I think everyone that was pushing it. I think they're all in some form accountable.
So for those that did spoke up and said, "Hey, there's a problem," do they have any accountability, or is it off of their hands now?
I think they've got to feel like they've at least done something, or at least tried to do something.
Yeah. I mean, how far can you push your superiors trying to say, "Hey, this is a problem," before they just get fed up with you? And I agree, they at least did something trying to put that warning out there.
Yeah, I say anyone who knew of an issue and didn't speak up has part of the blame.
That's a good point. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here, and it had me research the was it how the case or how things turned out, and watching this little video that it gave me a link to showed the last couple minutes of these people's lives, and when they were coming back into the atmosphere, and they were saying, hey, we have a problem here, and oh, looks like we're having a problem there, and so at that point they're realizing that things are going wrong according to the computer, but what can you do at that point? Your recovery window is gone, and the mission control as well as the astronauts had zero control to fix the problem once it was discovered at that point. So it's just recognizing a problem. What I got from that, at least, is recognizing a problem needs to not be. We can't delay the solution once you recognize the problem. Because at that point they had recognized it again for however many times they've recognized that foam had fallen off before, but now it was more serious, and it ended up to be fatal. So that's kind of what I got from how that turned out, and the case study overall is it's our personal responsibility to push whatever we need to the top if we feel that there is that much of a danger or a problem, and we can't wait. And yeah, so from the management team all the way down to debris assessment team, all the way to maybe even the astronauts themselves might have asked more questions or pushed a little bit harder to ask why these things were going unsolved in previous flights to help out with the safety of their flight and all future flights. So I think accountability can go to quite a few people. But in the end, it was the management team who decided on that acceptable risk. And yeah, this case study had a lot of issues in it. And there's probably many more that we didn't even get to, but we covered quite a bit. Was there anything else that anybody else wanted to say? Going to wrap up here, if not. All right. Sounds good. Then, yeah, thanks for coming. Sorry it took so long to get everybody on here and still not get Emily. That stinks. Do we know who is the group leader for next week? Does anybody know where to find that sheet? It took me forever. I forgot where to find it.
I can resend it. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yeah, we heard you perfectly that time.
Oh, dang it. I had so many ideas too. Just kidding. I can resend it to everyone because I'm not sure either. I don't know if it was Shelby. Have you gone yet?
Sorry, on my list it says Shelby, you're next week.
Okay, sounds good. I knew it was coming up. I just didn't know if it was this week or next week. So.
Okay.
Also, maybe we should get Eve a week because she's not on that list.
I'll sacrifice my second week if she wants it.
Dang it.
Thanks for taking us for the time.
So, all right, Shelby, you got next week?
Yep.
And same time?
That works for me.
All right. See everybody next week.
Thanks,
Yes,
guys.
Have a good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.
Bye.